Welcome back to Can I Has Buff, the Warframe series that highlights older or weaker weapons in Warframe and offers buff suggestions to fix or rework them into the current game. In this episode, we take a look at the recently buffed Hind and why it still could use some work. The Hind was introduced on August 16, 2013 in its own Tenno Reinforcements video that also included a few fixes and tweaks and used primarily by elite lancers. It was later buffed DPS-wise in hotfix 17.4.3, the Mana Few Words quest update, which allowed fire rate to increase the time between bursts. Still, although the weapon became fairly solid and easier to handle, it still fell to deaf ears from the community. That is, however, until Update 20 rolled in with Octavia's Anthem on March 24, 2017, which gave the weapon an alt-fire with boosted stats. Not only does this new alt-fire deal 20 more base damage, but it doubled the crit chance and gave it a 2x critical multiplier, which allowed the Hind to perform decently well as a crit weapon. Even better, the status chance is also doubled in this mode, meaning it could take advantage of deadly crit slash procs which bleed the enemy from within. The Burst Fire mode fires 5 rounds at a time and has a good base damage of 30. It also has low recoil on this Burst Fire mode, making the shots accurate even when boosting the fire rate. This is where the issues come into play and why this weapon is still on the list for Can I Has Buff. The alt fire is slower, but has better stats across the board, making the burst fire essentially useless, especially on higher levels where the higher status, critically hitting slash procs can bleed the enemy faster than the burst fire. This is a phenomenon I've coined as the Stradivar effect. Like the Stradivar, the semi-auto mode is superior in every other way besides fire rate, so there's very little use to ever use the automatic fire mode. The same is true for the Hind, but this fact is made worse due to it not being in mode. Rather, pressing the alt fire will fire a single bullet, not switch modes like the Stradivar. So the player is forced to use a higher damage, slower firing mode, but is also forced to fiddle around with their alt fire button as well. However, as I mentioned, this alt fire does significantly more damage when built for crit compared to a non-crit burst fire build, so I'm actually not suggesting a buff for this alt fire. Instead, I wish to make this alt fire a switchable mode and focus on giving the burst fire some more use. To give the burst fire some use, I suggest lowering the damage by 5 to 25 base damage, but boosting the status to 25%, 5 more than the alt fire. This would allow the burst fire to quickly strip armor, then the player could also then switch to the semi-auto mode to take advantage of the high crits and finish them off. This would be a smooth way of reworking the Hind without changing its new alt fire. Without changing any other stat, I suggest increasing the slash damage of the burst fire mode by a flat 25, giving the burst fire a base damage of 55 in total. This would allow the burst fire to have better damage, but still give the alt fire a use, as its higher status and crits would allow it to trigger slash procs more often, and deadlier ones at that. Similar to my first suggestion, but a bit weaker. Enemies will now store the damage the burst fire of the Hind does to them, and enemies who die for any reason after being hit by the weapon will explode and spew out sharpened bullet shards into surrounding enemies at about 4 or 5 meters, dealing 5% of the total damage that was pumped into them as pure slash damage in the form of 5 shards, which have a small chance to proc. These shrapnel shards do not count as bullets into other enemies, so if enemies die by the shards or by the explosion, they won't also explode unless they were damaged with the Hind prior, but only deal the damage they were dealt with the weapon in the first place. In addition, these shards remain on the ground if they did not strike enemies and will act just like armor shards with Meg's Polarize, adding damage to her attacks. So that's the Hind, a spicy baguette that even after its buff could use a bit more baking in the oven. What do you think of the Hind? Do you think the burst fire was left behind with the buff? If so, do my buff suggestions sound like good ideas? In any case, thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next installment of Can I Has Buff. a spicy Italian baguette,